Hello, everybody. I'm so glad we're together again for Chapter 10 of Pilgrim's Progress. Chapter 9 was Doubting Castle, Giant Despair, being beaten. Oh, my. But then remember how Christian remembered that he had a key in his pocket that could unlock the gate, which they should have used days earlier, but he forgot all about God's precious promises. But now he remembered that key and he got it out, and lo and behold, it opened the door to their cell. It opened the door to the courtyard of the castle, and it even opened a big iron gate that led to the whole castle grounds, and they were out of there and on their way. I'm sure Giant Despair was very surprised when he came back to the cell the next day, planning to kill them, and they were gone. They were gone. God's precious promises can be a good weapon for us when we're fighting against Satan. Well, let's read the next chapter, which is called The Shepherds in the Mountains. After Christian and Hopeful escaped Doubting Castle, they continued on their way, ascending the delectable mountains that belong to the king, which I previously mentioned before. There they found gardens, orchards, vineyards, and fountains where they washed themselves and were refreshed and nourished. Here's a lovely picture of the stream there and them having a nice snack of fruit and washing themselves in that. I'm sure after being a week or more in Giant Despair's dirty, filthy dungeon and having nothing to eat or drink, this was a delightful change for them. There were shepherds on top of these mountains, feeding their flocks and standing by the side of the way. It was customary in those days for weary travelers to stop and talk, so the pilgrims approached the shepherds, who were leaning on their staffs, and asked, "Who owns these delectable mountains and all these sheep that are grazing on them?" And the shepherds replied, "The mountains belong to Emmanuel, and from here you can see the celestial city. The sheep also are his, and he laid down his life for them." "So this is the way to the celestial city?" Christian asked excitedly, and they nodded and said, "You are going in the right direction." Christian gazed down the road. "How much further do we have to go?" "It's too far, except for those who will no doubt arrive there." Christian glanced over at Hopeful, and then back to the shepherds. "Is the way safe or dangerous?" "It's safe for some, but sinful men will fall there." Christian and Hopeful were completely exhausted from their journey. "We are very tired," they said to the shepherds. "Is there a place where we might rest a while?" "The Lord of these mountains has ordered us not to forget to entertain strangers," said the shepherds. "Therefore, everything that's good here is for your refreshment." When the shepherds learned that Christian and Hopeful had been traveling on the way, they began to ask them many of the same questions that had been asked before in other places, including, "Where did you come from? How did you enter the way? How have you persevered this far?" The shepherds knew that very few pilgrims who begin a journey to these mountains ever get this far. After Christian and Hopeful told their stories, the shepherds invited them to stay, saying, "Welcome to the delectable mountains." The shepherds, whose names were Knowledge, Experience, Watchful, and Sincere, led them by their hands to some tents, where a meal was prepared for them. And in addition, the shepherds said, "We would like you to stay here for a while and spend some time with us and enjoy the comforts of the delectable mountains." And Christian and Hopeful agreed to stay, and since it was late, they all went to bed. The next morning, at the shepherds' invitation, Christian and Hopeful walked with them on the mountains for a while, enjoying a pleasant view from every side. Then the shepherds began to talk to each other, saying, "Should we show them the wonders that are only found in these mountains?" But they all agreed to do so, and led Christian and Hopeful to the top of a hill called Error, which was very steep on the far side. "Look down at the bottom," they said. When Christian and Hopeful peered over, they saw several men at the bottom who were torn in pieces, having obviously fallen from the top. "What does this mean?" Christian asked, unable to remove his eyes from those men below. And the shepherds answered, Haven't you heard about the people who were led into error by listening to Hymenaeus and Philetus with regarding the faith of the resurrection of the body? Yes, they answered. Those who you see at the bottom of these mountains are they, and they have remained unburied to this day. They have now become a warning for others to be careful how high they climb or how close they come to the extreme edge of this mountain. The shepherds then led them to the top of another mountain named Caution and told them to look far off into the valley in the direction that they had come. When they did, they thought they could see several men walking up and down among several graves there. But it was obvious that these men were blind because they were stumbling over the graves and couldn't find their way out. And Christian asked once again, "What does this mean?" And the shepherds answered, "Before you came to this mountain, did you notice a little step, a stile, leading over into a meadow on the left-hand side of the way?" Christian and Hopeful regretfully remembered the dark castle from which they had just escaped, and they sheepishly replied, "Yes." "From those steps," said the shepherd, "there's a path that leads directly to Doubting Castle, which is owned by Giant Despair." And he pointed to the blind wandering among the graves. "Those men were once on a journey just as you are now until they came to that step. You see, the right way was rough in that area, and they chose to leave the way and cross over into the meadow and were taken captive by Giant Despair and cast into Doubting Castle. And after they had been kept in the dungeon for some time, the giant eventually blinded them and led them out here among these graves, where he has left them to wander to this very day, so that the saying of the wise man might be fulfilled, 'He who wanders out of the way of understanding will remain in the congregation of the dead.'" After hearing this, Christian and Hopeful looked at each other with tears streaming down their faces, but they said nothing to the shepherds. The shepherds continued guiding them to another place in the valley where there was a door in the side of the hill. And opening the door, they told them to look in. The pilgrims looked inside and found it very dark and smoky. They also thought they could hear the rumbling sounds of a fire, the cries of tormented souls, and the stench of sulfur in the air. Christian was terrified and turned back to the shepherds with his voice quivering. "What does this mean?" And the shepherds told them, "This is a road straight to hell, which hypocrites enter, like Esau, who would sell his birthright, or Judas, who sold his master, Alexander, who blasphemed the gospel, and Ananias and his wife Sapphira, who lied and deceived." Hopeful thought for a moment and asked, "Is it true that each of them had the reputation for being a pilgrim like us?" And the shepherds said yes, and they had traveled quite a distance too. "Well, exactly how far did these pilgrims travel before they were miserably cast away?" Hopeful asked. "Some completed most of the journey," replied the shepherds, while others did not make it as far as these mountains. Christian and Hopeful said to each other, "We need to cry to the Strong One for strength." "Yes, and you will have need to draw on that strength when you have it," said the shepherds. By this time, the pilgrims had a desire to press on, and the shepherds agreed that they should. So they walked together to the end of the mountains. And the shepherds said to one another, "Let's show them a view of the gates of the celestial city, provided they have the skill to look through our perspective glass." Here's a picture of the shepherds and Christian and Hopeful up on the top. And they've got I guess it's Hopeful, has the, I don't know which one it is, has the perspective glass. It's sort of like a telescope in his hands, and he's struggling to look through it so he can get a picture of the celestial city. It's a long way off still, but you could see it if you use that telescope thing correctly. The pilgrims were excited at the prospect and were led to the top of a high hill called Clear and given the shepherd's perspective glass to look through. They tried to look through it, but it was difficult to hold the glass steady because they were still shaking. after the memory of that previous night. Still, they thought that they saw something like a gate and some of the glory of the place. And they went away and sang. Thus by the shepherds secrets are revealed, which from all other men are kept concealed. Come to the shepherds then, if you would see things deep, things hid, and that mysterious be. And when they were about to leave, one of the shepherds gave them written instructions describing the way ahead. And another one warned them, beware of the flatterer. And the third one told them, don't sleep on enchanted ground. And the fourth one wished them success and safety for their journey ahead. Christian and Hopeful descended from the mountains on the highway leading toward the celestial city. A little below these mountains, on the left side of the path, lay the country of Conceit. There was a little crooked path coming from this country that met up with the way, and it was here that the two pilgrims met a very lively young man named Ignorance. Christian approached the man and asked, where are you from and where are you going? Sir, I was born in the country of Conceit, he said, pointing back to the crooked path, and I'm going to the celestial city. Christian appeared confused and glanced back at that little crooked path and then again at Ignorance. But how do you expect to be admitted at the gate? Don't you think it might be difficult to gain entrance there? Ignorance just shrugged. I can't imagine why. I plan to enter just the same as other good people do. But what qualification do you have to show them at the gate so that it will open to you? Oh, well, I know God's will, and I've lived a good life, Ignorance said with an air of confidence. I pay all my debts, and I pray, and I fast, and I tithe, and I give to charity. And what's more, I left my own country to come here. But you didn't enter at the wicket gate, which is the beginning of the way. You came in by way of this crooked path, said Christian. I'm afraid that whatever you may think of yourself, when the day of final reckoning comes, you will be guilty of being a thief and a robber, and you will not gain entrance to the celestial city. Gentlemen, said Ignorance with a slight smirk, we are strangers, and I don't know you, so why don't you be content to follow your own religion and let me follow mine, and we'll hope that all will be well in the end. And as for the wicket gate that you mentioned, everybody around here knows that it's quite a distance away. I doubt anyone even knows how to get there, but it doesn't matter anyway. After all, we have, as you see, a fine, pleasant, green path that leads from our country straight down to the way. When Christian saw that the man was wise in his own eyes, he whispered to Hopeful, there's more hope for a fool than for him. When a fool walks along the way, his wisdom fails him, and he demonstrates to everyone that he is a fool. Christian was disappointed that he couldn't get through to Ignorance. Should we talk with him some more, or should we walk on ahead and let him think about what he's heard? Perhaps we could stop again later to see if then maybe we could help him. Hopeful thought about it for a minute, and he said, yes, let's leave Ignorance alone to think about all that has been said in hopes that he won't refuse to accept good counsel. Otherwise, he'll remain ignorant of the truth. God has said that though he made them, he will not save them just because they do not understand. Hopeful continued, I don't think it's wise to tell him everything at once. If you agree, let's move on ahead and plan to talk with him again later when he's better prepared to receive it. Christian and Hopeful went on their way while Ignorance followed behind them. After creating some distance between them, they entered a very dark path where they saw a man who had been bound with 7 strong cords by 7 devils. And the devils were carrying the man back to the door that the pilgrims had seen on the side of the hill when they were with the shepherds. Both Christian and Hopeful were terrified as they watched the devils lead the man away. Christian learned to see if he knew who the man was, thinking that it might be Turnaway, who lived in the town of Apostasy. But he couldn't see his face, because the man hung his head like a thief who had been caught. Hopeful watched as he was taken away, and he noticed a paper with this inscription, reckless and uncontrolled professor and damnable apostate. Ooh, what a paper to have. While Christian and Hopeful were reflecting on the tragic end of Turnaway, Christian said, "This reminds me of another story about something that happened to a good man named Little Faith. He lived in the region over by the town of Sincere." And Christian then began to tell the story as he had been told it. "There is an entrance to the way called Dead Man's Lane that comes down from Broadway Gate. It's a dangerous path because many murders are committed there. Like us, Little Faith was going on a pilgrimage and just happened to sit down at that intersection, and he fell asleep. About the same time, 3 strong villains named Faintheart, Mistrust, and Guilt, who were brothers, came down the lane from Broadway Gate, and when they spotted Little Faith sleeping by the way, they ran toward him. Little Faith was just waking up and getting ready to continue his journey when these 3 brutes approached him, threatening his life and ordering him to his feet. Little Faith turned white as a sheet, and he didn't have the strength to either fight them or run away. Faintheart demanded, 'Hand over your money.' But Little Faith was slow to respond because he didn't really want to lose his money. Mistrust saw an opportunity and rushed in and put his hand in one of Little Faith's pockets and pulled out a bag of silver. No sooner had Little Faith cried out, 'Thieves! Thieves!' than Guilt moved in and struck Little Faith on the head with a big club, knocking him to the ground. The thieves just stood around watching him bleed to death until they heard others on the path, and fleeing that it might be Great Grace, who lives in the town of Good Confidence, they quickly turned and ran away, leaving their poor victim to fend for himself." Christian paused for a moment and then went on with his story. After a little while, Little Faith came to himself and managed to get to his feet, and he staggered along in his pilgrimage as best he could. Saddened by this story, Hopeful asked, "But did the thieves steal everything from him?" "No," Christian said, shaking his head. "They never checked the pocket where he kept his jewels, so he was able to keep those. But as it was told to me, the thieves got most of his spending money, which left him overcome with grief. They did not get his jewels, but the little bit of money he did have left was not nearly enough to last him the rest of the journey. Unless I was misinformed, he was forced to beg while traveling just to stay alive, for he would not sell his jewels. He traveled like this the rest of the way, scratching out a living, but mostly on an empty stomach." "Well, isn't it remarkable that the thieves didn't steal his certificate that would have let him into the Celestial City?" Hopeful asked curiously. "Yes, it is remarkable, but they did not get it," said Christian. "It was not due to any cunning on the part of Little Faith. They caught him off guard when they attacked him, and he didn't have the power or skill to hide anything. This is credit more to good providence than any effort on his part that they missed such a valuable item." Hopeful nodded. Nevertheless, he must have been comforted by the fact that they didn't steal his jewels. Well, the jewels might have been a great comfort to him had he appreciated them as he should have, but as someone told me, he didn't speak about the jewels for most of his journey because he was so upset at losing his money. In fact, he mostly forgot about them. But occasionally, when he did think about them, he was quickly overwhelmed by the thought of the loss of his spending money. "What a sad story about this poor man," Hopeful said, shaking his head. "I'm sure his situation was a continual source of grief to him." "Oh, yes, he was deeply distressed," said Christian. "I'm sure either one of us would have felt the same if we'd been robbed and assaulted like he was in such a terrible place. It's a wonder he didn't die of grief, poor soul. I'm told that he was depressed and bitterly complained over his loss for the rest of his journey. He would tell everyone he encountered on the way how he was robbed, who robbed him, who assaulted him, and that he had barely escaped with his life. Well, it's surprising that he didn't try to sell some of his jewels to make the journey a little more comfortable." Christian's eyes raised in surprise as he was astounded by Hopeful's comment. "You are talking like a child, Hopeful. What reason would he ever have to sell his jewels? And who would he pawn them to? In the country where he was robbed, his jewels were not considered valuable, nor did he want anything from the citizens who lived there. Besides, he knew that if his jewels were missing at the gates of the celestial city, he would never receive an inheritance there. That would have been worse to him than all the wicked schemes of 10,000 thieves. "Why are you being so sharp with me, Christian?" Hopeful then said. "Esau sold his birthright for a pot of stew, and that birthright was his greatest jewel. So if he sold such a valuable treasure, why didn't Little Faith do the same?" Christian couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Well, you're right. Esau did sell his birthright, and so have many others, but in doing so, they have excluded themselves from receiving the ultimate blessing, just as that coward Esau did. Surely you must see the difference between the spiritual condition of Esau and Little Faith. Esau despised his birthright, but Little Faith valued his jewels. Esau's God was his stomach, but Little Faith's was not. Esau was driven by his worldly passions, but Little Faith was not. Besides, Esau could see no further than to the fulfilling of his hunger when he said, "I am at the point of death, so what good will my birthright do me?" But Little Faith, though he was just given a little faith, was kept from such extremes. That same faith caused him to value his jewels rather than sell them, like Esau did. You don't read anywhere, do you, of the faith of Esau? Not even a little. Therefore, it's not surprising in the case of Esau that he was controlled by his desires. For where there is no faith to resist, one will sell his birthright, his soul, and everything that he has, even sell them to the devil in hell. This man can be compared to a wild donkey that cannot be turned away. When their minds are set on lusts, they will have them, whatever the cost. No, Little Faith was a true pilgrim. His mind was focused on the things of God, and his livelihood was in spiritual matters from heaven. Therefore, what reason would someone of his character have to sell his precious jewels? If there had been anyone interested in buying them, it would only be to fill his mind with empty things. Will a man give a penny to eat hay when he's hungry? Or can you persuade a dove to feast on the decaying flesh of a dead animal, like a crow does? Those without faith will pawn, mortgage, or sell what they have, and even themselves to fulfill their desires. But those that have saving faith, even just a little of it, cannot do that. And hopeful, that is where you are mistaken. Hopeful was becoming a little annoyed with Christian's harsh tone. I acknowledge my error, but I must admit that your severe response has almost made me angry. Don't take offense, Christian said, placing a hand on Hopeful's shoulder. I only did so to compare your understanding of the matter to that of a baby bird that eagerly runs back and forth, not knowing where they're going, with their little shells are still upon their heads. But let's leave the matter behind us and consider it under debate, and all will be well between you and me. Hopeful nodded in agreement, and then he countered once again, But Christian, I believe with all my heart that those who attacked Little Faith were nothing but cowards. Why else would they have run away so quickly when they heard someone approaching? And why wasn't Little Faith more courageous? In my opinion, he might have been able to stand his ground, at least for a little while, without being overpowered. It's true, most people would agree with you that those assailants are coward, but few have found them to be the case when they are the ones being assaulted. As for Little Faith having a courageous heart, he had no such thing. And I am confident, my brother, that had the same thing happened to you, you would have surrendered quickly too. In all fairness, it's easy to be courageous while these people are far away, but you might have second thoughts if they suddenly appeared to challenge them, as they did to poor Little Faith. Also, let's not forget that these men were hired thieves who serve under the rule of the king of the bottomless pit, and if needed, he will come to their aid, roaring like a lion. I myself experienced a conflict much like Little Faith's, and I found it terrifying. These three villains attacked me, and I began to resist them, as a Christian should, But they quickly called for help, and their master came right away. As the saying goes, I would have given my life for a penny. However, God had other plans, and I was clothed in battle-tested armor. But even though I was well equipped, I found it difficult to prove myself spiritually mature. No one can understand what it's like to experience such combat unless they have been in the thick of battle themselves. Hopeful considered what Christian had to say, and then he responded confidently, well, there's no doubt that these thieves ran on down the road when they thought great grace was coming. That is true, said Christian. They and their master have often fled when they feared great grace was close. But why should we be surprised at that, since he is the king's champion? I trust that you will allow some distinction between little faith and the king's champion. Not all the king's subjects are his champions, and not all of them can accomplish such feats of war as he does. But is it reasonable to expect that a child could handle Goliath, as David did, or that a small bird should have the strength of an ox? Some pilgrims are strong, while others are weak. Some have great faith, while others just have a little. This man, Little Faith, was one of the weaker types, and therefore he suffered exhaustion and humiliation. Hopeful sighed. I still wish Great Grace had arrived to take care of those thieves. Well, if he had, he would have had his hands full, said Christian. There is no doubt that Great Grace is a highly skilled warrior with excellent weapons and a sharp sword. He can do very well against such opponents, but if faint heart, mistrust, or guilt can get close enough to penetrate his armor, he will fall hard. And when a man is down, what can he do? Whoever looks closely at the face of Great Grace will see scars and cuts that clearly prove what I am saying. I have heard it reported that he even despaired for his life once in battle. Is it not true that these rogues and their accomplices were able to make David groan and mourn and roar in suffering? And they did the same thing to Hezekiah. Even though they were champions in their days, they were forced to take a stand when assaulted by those thieves, and they took quite a beating. On one occasion, Peter, who some say was the prince of the apostles, was so roughed up by them that he became afraid of a servant girl. Besides, their evil king is always listening for their call, and if at any time they losing in battle, he will, wherever possible, come to their aid for that reason. And so it has been said of him, no sword, spear, dart, or javelin that strikes him will succeed. He regards iron as straw and bronze as rotten wood. Arrows will not make him flee. Sling stones are turned by him into rubble. Darts are considered straw, and he laughs at the rattling of spears. So what is a man to do in that situation? No doubt if this man had full access to Job's horse and the skill and courage to ride him, he might do extraordinary things for his king. For it is said of this horse that his neck is clothed with thunder, and it is not afraid like a grasshopper. He strikes terror with the snorting of his nostrils. He paws at the valley and rejoices in his strength, and then charges to meet armed men. He laughs at fear, afraid of nothing, and he will never shy away from the sword. The quiver rattles against his side, as does the flashing spear and the sword. As he runs, he eats up the ground with fierceness and rage, and cannot stand still when the trumpet sounds. The blast of the trumpet makes him snort, aha, and he catches the scent of a distant battle and the thundering of the captains with their battle cry. But hopeful, we are foot soldiers, and we should never desire to meet an enemy in battle or boast that we could do better when we hear of others who have been defeated. Nor should we entertain thoughts that our own spiritual maturity is braver than theirs, because those that think that way often suffer the worst. Think of Peter, for instance, when he was tried. He would parade his bravery, but because of his pride, he considered himself ready to stand and defend his master. But who was more defeated and scared than he when those villains were on the attack? So when we hear of such attacks taking place on the king's highway, we should respond in two ways. First, let's be well equipped with our weapons, especially a shield, the shield of faith. For it was the lack of a shield that made it impossible for the brave warrior who attacked Leviathan to make him surrender. It's true that if our shield is missing, he does not fear us at all. That is why a skilled warrior like Paul said, above all, take the shield of faith, with which you will be able to extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Second, it's also good to request the convoy of the king, and he that will go with us himself. This prospect made David rejoice when he passed through the valley of the shadow of death. And Moses said that he would prefer dying where he stood rather than go one more step without his God. Christian clasped his hands together. Oh, hopeful, if our king will just go along with us, why should we be afraid of 10,000 who plot against us? But without our king, the proud will only find refuge being dead. As for myself, I've been in the thick of battle before, as you can see, and I'm only alive because of the goodness of his grace, not because of great spiritual maturity on my part. I would be glad to never experience any more such attacks, but I fear that we have not yet passed beyond all danger. However, since the lion and the bear have not yet devoured me, I hope God will also deliver us from the next enemy that we meet. And that is the end of chapter 10. And the next chapter is called The Ensnarement of the Flatterer. Do you remember that the shepherds told them, beware of the flatterer, don't listen to him? This chapter is called The Ensnarement of the Flatterer. It sounds like Christian and Hopeful are heading for some trouble, doesn't it? We hope that they will remember to pray that the king will come with them, just like Christian was talking about then. Because just like he said, we cannot fight against the devil by ourselves. We can only do it in his power. But he promises us that when we ask him, he will. He will. So when we don't, when we think, oh, I can handle this myself, oh boy, we're just setting ourselves up for a bad time, aren't we? Well, on that note, it's not a happy note, but on that promising note that his ears are open to the cries of his people to come and help them when they are in their hour of need. Let's pray that God will use all these difficult experiences to make us better Christians, better followers of him, and make us further along the way, closer to the celestial city. That's what I'm praying, and I bet you are too. Good night for now, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.